Let's now talk about some important early models of context which have been used or are being used to conceptualize context in contemporary critical discourse analysis. Among the early models, we have some thoughts from Malinowski, Firth, Halliday, Sapir, and Wolff. These are the inspirations, or these are the models which were not primarily proposed for critical discourse analysis. Rather, we have developed certain approaches in critical discourse analysis based on these early models of the understanding of language in various contexts. Since the Saucer's legendary thoughts of the distinction between Lang and Prohl, and then later on the distinction which was proposed by Chomsky between competence and performance. What we know is competence, and how we say it in terms of language is our performance, and there can be a distinction between competence and performance. We may know something accurately, but we may not perform that thing that accurately. Uh, because of the popularity of these thoughts, most of linguists in the world, especially in the first half of the previous century and some part of the later half also, they have been focusing on typical linguistic elements of a certain language, and they have been focusing on decontextualized sentences, which would be understood purely for their linguistic components, and their overall broader social context was somehow, if not denied, was ignored in the overall understanding of the meaning. But later on, there was a clear change of trend, and there were many social and political critics who emphasized on the importance of context in understanding the language, because language primarily is not if we look at the meaning from a meaning perspective, is not only or merely a collection of certain sounds. Rather, it's a tool to convey certain message, and in order to understand a message, we need to know the context. So language, if we divide it from its context, would become useless, would be taken away from its basic purpose. So the early thoughts of the importance of social context of a talk comes to us from many researchers working in various fields. For example, an anthropologist, Malinowski, suggested that a word without its linguistic context is merely a figment, and it stands for nothing. It has no meaning. So context is the primary thing. Sociocultural context, it shapes the linguistic context and linguistic choices. Therefore, in order to understand the meaning, we need to understand that context. Then Firth and Halliday also said that in order to understand the meaning of an utterance, we need to know the context of situation and the broader context of culture. The situation in which it is being said, and the overall broader socio-cultural, socio-political culture, and the conventions and norms which facilitate us to make that discourse, and then later on understand that discourse. Sapir and Wolff, they were more cognitive in their approaches, and they thought that language representing the mental life of its speaker, their cognitive orientation reflects that a language shows thought of its speaker, and thought has an effect on the language of the speaker. So they are in a mutual relationship. Therefore, it is important to know the context in which a language is being produced. Otherwise, we would not be able to interpret it properly, because since we would not be able to understand the impacts on language, the thought which is influencing a particular language, we would not be able to understand the proper meaning of a certain piece of language. In other words, we can say that we need to understand the culture underlying a language uh, in order to know its meaning, because that actually leads us to reach the deeper meaning of a sentence. Then Himes is more social in his approach. He has developed some methodology also. Himes' overall speaking mnemonic is a kind of a toolkit which can be used to understand context in particular ways, especially social and linguistic context simultaneously. He developed his model for to know the ethnography of speaking, but this can equally be applied in discourse studies and even in critical discourse studies. Let's now try to know some of the aspects of his model, and which constitute various minor elements. For example, one of the elements is the setting, which is the physical setting or situation in which a certain discourse is being produced. For example, for an official communication, it could be the office itself or a kind of meeting room, which could be the setting of the discourse. Then participants, who is the speaker, hearer, or overhearer, or who are the overall participants in a discourse. Then ends, what are the purposes, goals, and outcomes of a certain possible outcomes assumed by the speakers and the hearers. For example, we start a discussion to reach a particular kind of discussion. We may not necessarily reach that conclusion, but we have in mind that we might reach among few possible conclusions. So these possible conclusions actually define the ends of a discourse. That also constitute the context, by the way, according to Himes' mnemonic speaking toolkit. Then act sequence, which actually form the event which has been taken place, or ordering of speech acts, in which order they have taken place, what happened first, what later, what should be said first, what should be said later. This all helps us in knowing the ethnography of speaking and also knowing various elements of the linguistic context of a discourse. Then key is another factor which involves tone, manners, spirit of the speech acts, etc. Then we have instrumentalities, which mainly constitute the channels or mode of communication. For example, this could be telephone, this could be a face-to-face talk, or spoken or written discourse in any other form. Then norms of interaction and interpretation in a certain society, in a certain setting, or in a certain official or political communication. For example, we can see that the norms of speaking in a public procession may be different from the norms of speaking in an important gathering of a parliament. So norms also define some aspects of the context. Then genre, the type of event, speech event which is under discussion. This may be a lively talk, a joke, maybe storytelling, or maybe a serious meeting. Pragmatics and the pragmatic concept of context is is an important insight into overall understanding of context, and which the recent models of critical discourse analysis have applied quite generously also. In this regard, Grice's cooperative principle has been the prime force. It focuses on the interpretation of utterances, because inferential process is based on rational thought and context. We cannot infer things, which is key to pragmatics, without the knowledge of context. Therefore, context becomes very important. Even cognitive pragmatics helps us knowing the internal context and focuses on understanding such context, because meanings are mediated by such context. Then there are many concepts of pragmatics, for example, presupposition, indirect speech acts, irony, phrase, and politeness, which would become very difficult to be understood if we deny the element of context from pragmatic analysis. One of the critique of pragmatic approaches to critical discourse study is that they are too individualistic, because inference which we get, though it may be based on context, is very personal, maybe personal or individual. Therefore, it denies, may not completely, but somehow it denies the complete importance of sociocultural factors and power imbalances in a society, and which are the key instruments to understand and analyze a discourse in critical discourse analysis. Overall, we can sum up that all these approaches to to context, which has been used in different fields of knowledge, maybe help us to develop a deep understanding of context in critical discourse studies.